What is up, everybody? This is the Sharp Angles podcast. I am Raymond Summerlin, and we have a very special edition of the Sharp Angles podcast. The reason it's called the Sharp Angles podcast, the man is here. We're going to talk about the schedule. Warren has been grinding on the schedule since it was released last Wednesday. If you're listening to this podcast, we're recording this on Monday night, Monday the 20th, the evening. Since last Wednesday, he's been grinding on the schedule, sending messages at all hours of the night about the schedule. This man loves the schedule, and I'm glad that he's here to get to talk about it. And that is the one, the only Warren Sharp. How you doing, Warren?
I'm good. I love, it's kind of like when I do the book, I just focus, I go into a little hole, I work on it, and then I come out, resurface, feel a little bit more energized, excited to share some of my findings with people. But yeah, it's stressful. Obviously that night that the schedule drops is an extremely exciting day for everybody, all fans of their teams, because they get to see when they might be traveling to see their team play in different games. They get to see what times they're going to play. But for the most part, for me, I start going into my analyzing mode, and I start breaking down all the rest disadvantages or advantages that certain teams have, and things that I don't think the NFL accounts for properly. And it's going to be fun to discuss those with you over the next hour here.
Yeah, there are a lot of them, and I really had fun with. We've been doing this for several years now, and you had some concerns heading into this, this schedule. I wouldn't say concerns. I think you had some hopes, is actually probably how I would word that we were going to have a schedule that probably had less rest disparity, less what we would characterize, at least at Sharp Football Analysis, as issues. The NFL probably doesn't characterize them as issues. That's some of the stuff we'll talk about tonight. But we were hopeful that there would be fewer issues. We didn't know what the article that you do every year was going to be about, if that was the case. But then we got to the schedule, and it seems like and we'll get into all the specifics, but just from like a 10,000 feet view, it feels like it's not better, it's actually worse. And it's odd given the focus that has been put onto this issue specifically by you over the last several years. And we know that the NFL knows about those, because as we'll get to in a bit, they have actually mentioned you in the work you've done on this rest stuff. So they know about it, and we've gone the other way. So it's just an interesting it's an interesting development that I don't think we expected 2 weeks ago. So it really has been a fascinating few days.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a great recall, because there was a time when we were planning out our content, a month ago. I thought, hey, this article that we might be doing this year might not have a lot of good meat in it. We might be talking more about how the NFL has improved their strategy. And the reason we thought along those lines, Ray, for the listeners, is because the NFL was out there trying to hire some data scientists to assist with their schedule development. So we assumed they filled those roles, and those people were going to help make the schedule a little bit more fair and equitable to all 32 teams, because the 2023 schedule was very bad. It was a big step backwards from what 2020, 2021, 2022 schedule from an equity perspective. There were a lot more issues there. So I thought, for sure, 2024 can't be worse. It's probably going to be better. They're going to make some improvements. There might not be some glaring oversights that they came up with. But not only was that not the case, and there were issues, it's gotten worse. And from hearing from one of the schedule guys, and we'll discuss him and play some of his cuts, who seems like a great guy, by the way. He seems like a nice guy. I don't think this is because he wants to do it this way. I think he's being told, an edict handed down to him to do it this way. But the NFL now cares far more about the almighty dollar and their TV deals. And they've gotten so excited about the Taylor Swift deal that they put on there, that wild card game on, was it Saturday night with the Kansas City Chiefs, and it was on Peacock, and it broke records. It set the streaming record. And so they started realizing, hey, we can sell more games. We can get more on pay-per-view. We can make us a ton more money, of which they only give some of that to the league, to the teams, rather. They split it up. We'll make a lot more money for ourselves if we figure out a way to get better and more compelling games on primetime TV. And all I heard about was narrative. The storyline for this game, the storyline for that game. Well, you want to have this game at this point in the season. And it was just nonstop about the story of the season, as opposed to trying to give all 32 teams, we know there are, some of these teams can't win the Super Bowl, but give them a somewhat level playing field as they enter into the season. And the NFL is pivoting away and not caring so much about doing that. And not many people are digging into this to the degree that we do here at Sharp Football Analysis. And so that's why I'm excited to share these findings with everybody, because we've uncovered a lot of things that everybody should be aware of, including a lot of the different teams out there who might have been impacted.
And to your point, we're going to talk about a lot of teams specifically. We actually have a comment here. Having the second worst disadvantage is brutal for the Broncos with a rookie quarterback, and that's what we're talking about. You say most of these teams probably don't have a chance to win the Super Bowl. I don't think even the most excited Broncos fans really think that their team has a chance to win the Super Bowl this year. Although, I mean, let's think back to last year, what we thought about the Rams at this point last year. So anything could happen in the NFL. But if you are looking at your team and saying, well, I want us to win as many games as possible, and this has been the hand that you've been dealt by the NFL. I mean, it's tough. And where you can find actually all that information, we're going to go through some few teams. We're going to hit, obviously, the major points. But if you head over to sharpfootballanalysis.com, there's an article that Warren has written. It's an expansive article. Teams helped and hurt by the 2024 NFL schedule. Go and check that out. Also, over on the website, you can find fantasy rankings from Rich Rebar. You can find Todd Burrows' best ball ranking write-ups from Rich will be coming up this week as part of our fantasy football draft kit. Go and check that out. The other thing you can do over at the website, which I would highly recommend, because all of our attention, now that the schedule is over, all of our attention is turned to writing the book, the preeminent NFL preview book that exists in the industry, Warren Sharp's 2024 Sharp Football Preview book. We're all working hard on that now. That is, I fully transitioned this week into working on the book, and so we're working on that. It should be coming out sometime in the next couple of months, but you can pre-order it right now at Sharp Football Analysis. Go and check that out. But I think we should go back and get started at the beginning. We talk all about these schedule advantages and disadvantages, these preparation advantages and disadvantages. The place to start is this. If you identify all these things and you say, this stuff is happening, well, the question becomes, who cares, right? The thing that matters is, does this actually matter? Why does rest matter? So what about rest matters, and why is this an important thing to look at just kind of in the first place?
Yeah, so schedule rest matters a ton, and we'll go into it a little bit later, the detail about what actually matters. But the reason that it is, and how you can measure it, and how it is a factor, and we'll show what the NFL thinks about that as well, and why I have a difference of opinion, let's say, due to the data that I have access to, particularly from the betting markets, which shows us why it actually does matter and is meaningful and is impactful to the teams. But if we zoom back out to your point, this is a very short season compared to the NBA, compared to Major League Baseball, all the other professional sports. The NFL has only 17 games. Every one of those games is played different teams. The NFL does not control who you play. So they can't have any involvement in who you play. That is all up to how you did last year. But what they do control is when you play those teams. It's the only involvement that they have. And the fact is, they should be looking to try to balance it out so that when that opening whistle happens before week one, the Thursday night kickoff occurs, all these teams feel like they've got a decent shot. And especially the ones that actually legitimately are in it. And the reason I say that is this. Even if a team like, let's pretend the New York Giants, does not have a chance to really win the Super Bowl this year, right? Like, at all intents and purposes, they're very unlikely to win the Super Bowl. Their performance this season impacts all of the players on the roster, all of the entirety of the coaching staff. And whether or not these guys get jobs, whether or not these guys get to stick around another year, whether they get fired, whether players get cut. And so if you're giving teams, and this is why this is, like, to me, it's like an NFLPA, like a players association issue, as well as the coaches themselves. Like, this is beyond just Roger Goodell telling the scheduler guys, put all the best games on prime time and don't worry about all this other small details. it impacts these coaches, it impacts these players, it impacts the jobs of so many people. If you're stuck in 4 straight games at a rest disadvantage and you end up losing and your season spirals out of control because you've lost some players due to injury that you wouldn't otherwise see potentially because of the short rest that you're dealing with. There's a variety of these issues. It impacts the teams, it impacts the coaches, it impacts the players on a personal level. So it's more than just fair and equitable across all 32 teams, and let's just try to make a schedule where everybody can compete. It also trickles down to the individuals. These are people that are being forced into these ridiculous, and I will say that and cannot emphasize it more, ridiculous situations that some of these teams are being forced into. And it's entirely avoidable. That's the thing. I mean, the computer models that they are utilizing could avoid this. You talk about the guardrails and what different parameters they could put in there. They could rule out a lot of these things. They could make it a lot more balanced if they wanted to. They clearly do not prioritize that right now. But that is why it matters so much, in my opinion.
And I think we see this in other sports as well. In other sports, I think of the NBA a lot. Obviously, the NBA playoffs are going on right now. We thought there might be a Game 7 right now that we would be competing with. Turns out that's not the case. The NBA playoffs are alive and well. And so much of the conversation over the last 5 to 10 years has been about load management. It's been about back-to-backs and things like that. And it seems like the NBA is really taking those things seriously and really looking at their schedules in those way. And whenever we look into what the NFL is doing, at least from the research you're doing, it doesn't seem like they're really accounting for this, at least as much as maybe they should be, right?
Absolutely. And I think that they are not, and this only happened within the last couple of years. And part of it, I'll be honest, like you watch ball a lot, I do too. A lot of people out there, Thursday night for years has been a disaster, right? Like what they were doing initially when they first started rolling out Thursday, because some of the people that just started watching the NFL in the last 5 years don't realize this, but 10, 15 years ago, like Thursday was reserved for a few times a week, obviously Thanksgiving, and then they started expanding it, but it was just a very small expansion project. Just a few regular season games were being played on Thursday. Then they decided to expand it to the entirety of the season. When they were doing that, they were playing basically all divisional games, right? Oh, it's teams you don't have to travel that much, and it's teams you're familiar with. So we're going to stick, the Tennessee Titans against the Jacksonville Jaguars. No offense to those two teams, but we'll stick these two teams together. And both of them, maybe they don't have great records, but we got to get somebody. These teams have to play on Thursday Night Football. And what we were finding is these games on Thursday night were terrible. For the most part, they were egregiously bad. And so the league wasn't making a lot of money. They weren't selling these to, they were just being broadcast on the NFL Network. And they tried to liven them up by doing what? Like Color Rush. Oh, let's do Color Rush. The Jaguars can wear all mustard uniforms and the Titans can wear all light blue uniforms.
Can I just jump in and say, please never do that again? Can we just, that is not the answer. Let's please never do that again. Yes, let's move past that.
Absolutely. I don't know why they thought that was a solution here. The rest, the uniforms. But that was egregious in my opinion. And so they now have realized, and they go in detail and discuss this, that it's about the teams. If you put good teams on Thursday Night Football, people are going to tune in. What was that game, Ray? Was it the Colts and the Broncos? Was it Matt Ryan and it was like 3-3 the whole game or something? Do you remember that game? Like
I don't, but years ago? You could have been describing 1,000 Thursday night games that we've watched. You could have been describing the Chargers. Wasn't the Chargers quitting on Brandon Staley? Wasn't that a Thursday night game? You could describe any number of Thursday night games, and you would be right.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And so now what the story is that the league is bought into is it's about the narratives. It's about the teams and get good teams on there. Now they're figuring out how to get multiple times. How can we put the same team on multiple different Thursday nights? It'll be multiple short weeks potentially, but then they get a mini bye afterwards. And so they're trying to just build up the product and get the ratings higher. And they know if they can get the ratings high, it'll sell. And then they can make more money off of it. So the name of the game now for the league, in my opinion, they've fully gone dark. They've fully turned a corner. It's all about ratings. It's all about money in the door from the TV deals. They know that's how they're going to bring everything in. That's how they're going to build and grow. And so that's the primary goal for them. It's no longer, well, let's make sure that both divisional games, both teams are from the same division, so it's not as much travel, and so it's not as much stress on their bodies and that sort of thing. Now it's all about who they can put on there. And for those reasons, that this is why the NFL doesn't care as much about rest. It's about the money. It's truly about the money.
So we actually had in the wake of the schedule release, we had Mike North, who's the NFL VP of broadcast planning, who went on several different podcasts. He joins the Ross Tucker podcast, which I believe you will be on later tonight. So we will have dueling opinions on that. But we've pulled a couple clips there from him talking about the schedule that we think are pretty interesting. And one of them is talking about kind of from what you were just mentioning there about how some of it is about narratives. We're talking more about, I believe he calls it more of an art than a science. So producer Matt, if you could play that art video real quick.
172 games to find the right home for them. What does that mean? Some of them sound like Sunday night football games. Some of them sound like Monday night football games. Others are qualifying for kickoff week 1. Some of them maybe belong on Thanksgiving or in London or in Germany. Others maybe belong on a Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Some maybe feel better early in the season. Some feel better late in the season. What we don't do is say that game right there needs to be on that network in that week, lock it in and go. What we do is say a game like that could wear a lot of different hats. It could be Sunday night. It could be Monday night. It could be Thursday night. No, wait, it can't be Thursday night because it's a 3 time zone trip. So take it out of the pool for Thursday night, but it's still good for Sunday night. It's still good for Monday night. But if you're going to do it on Monday night, let's do it early in the season when we're still telling stories looking back, as opposed to late in the season when we're really telling stories looking ahead to the postseason.
And I think that video really illustrates a lot of what you're talking about here, and that it's a really good summation of this idea of it's really now the schedule is about narratives and how we can create these narratives and how we can kind of build interest in these games that we have sold for a lot of money to these companies that want good returns. And I think about the early kind of Prime Video Thursday night games where it seemed like Al Michaels was completely checked out and they were not getting what they were hoping for. And it seems like they're trying to avoid that in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about the narrative. It's about how they can sell these games. And in addition, it's about this key point where they're trying to balance it. If you could play the next video, there's another follow-up video to this one.
With the goal, Matt.
Maximize fan interest and minimize competitive inequities.
Yeah, so maximize viewership is number 1. Maximize fan interest is number 2. And minimize inequities between the teams is number 3. And I think the way, not always when somebody's describing a list, do they put it in the right order? But I truly think that is the order. And that's why he listed it as such, because he's probably discussed that many times with his staff. This is the order of priority. And the goal is to maximize the viewers. And in that whole discussion, he was talking about what they are tasked with doing. What is their job? And he said it's about placing these teams so that we know the games. Now it's just about finding their homes based upon what they feel like, what type of game it feels like. And so very much like an art. Now they're using computer modeling to schedule it all out, to like pull in the execution. But they're absolutely, on the slider bars in Madden where you're toggling things, they're absolutely scheduling it and toggling it towards having this be far more about the viewership than it is about the schedule inequities element of it. I'm not saying it's lip service, but I think that they've been told that we want to really maximize viewership. And so the reason it takes them weeks and weeks to do the schedule, because you could probably run a schedule, Ray, you might have a different opinion, but you can probably run a schedule that's very fair pretty quickly. But if you're really sitting there trying to art it up and get all these matchups and these storylines, what are we going to hype here? Well, if we give this game to that network, then what are we going to do on this other network? And it's all these different things about all these mouths to feed, which he has said before. Then it really is far more of an art, and we'll talk about it. There are some teams that royally got screwed this year, and there are more games that are have rest disadvantages this year than ever in NFL history, and it's because he has gotten focused on one thing and lost sight too much of the other.
And I think like we should head right into that list then, because and it's all over again over at Sharp Football Analysis. There's the full article. It's a long article about teams helped and hurt with individual team breakdowns and different categories. But when you say you feel like the competitive equity part of that is lip service, you're saying that because when we look at the schedule this year, we see a lot of things that you wouldn't expect in a schedule where rest equity was a primary goal. For instance, the number one largest net rest edge in your database's history for the Baltimore Ravens. There's a much bigger list than that. So what exactly are we looking at this year that suggests that not only are we seeing a lot of rest disparity this year, it is bigger than we even saw back in 2023 and certainly in the years prior to that?
Yeah, this is crazy. So I'll just read down a list of some of the bigger takeaways. There's a lot more to it than this, but I'm just going to give you the Cliff Notes version. If you tune in at any point during this first 20 minutes, Cliff Notes, the schedule, because of the focus by the NFL on maximizing viewership as the priority number one so they can get TV deals in the future, this year's schedule has the number one largest rest edge in my database's history, which goes back 35 years to 1990. The Baltimore Ravens are plus 16 days in net rest edge. So if you could throw up that graphic with the net rest edges, guys, what net rest edge is, bottom line, is it looks at basically on a game by game basis, do you have an extra day compared to your opponent to both rest and prepare for this game? If you do have exactly 1 day, let's give a good example. One team plays on Monday Night Football the prior week, and the other team played on Sunday the prior week. The team that played on Monday Night Football has 1 day less rest to prepare for that game. So they are a -1 for that game, whereas the team that had the extra day is a +1. All these things are going to balance out over the course of the season, the pluses and the minuses, but they're not evenly distributed. And that's why a team like the Baltimore Ravens, if you look at their line here at the top, 2 -1s on different games, and then they have a game with a 1-day rest advantage, 2 games with a 3-day rest advantage, another game with a 4-day rest advantage, and another game with a 7-day rest advantage. Sum those together, their net rest edge is plus 16. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have a team with the number one largest rest disadvantage of minus 21 days in the last decade, and that is the San Francisco 49ers. The largest rest disadvantage in the last decade is the 6th largest since 1990. Again, nobody out there is tracking this stuff except us. That's why it's important to publicize this and to do as much, spreading the word so that people, including coaches, owners, are aware of this. And I have talked to various different coaches. I have talked to owners in the past. They have taken some of this stuff and presented it to the league with different inequities, etc. Because they don't know this. They're not researching all of these little details on their own. They look at the schedule and they just see, hey, we don't have any. I mean, I've talked to some GMs who said, hey, the first thing I look at, do we have any home primetime games? Oh, no, we got fucked again by the league. They look, we keep going on the road on primetime. Like, they're focused on some of the most basic things. They don't have time to run these rest calculations. The odd thing about the San Francisco 49ers, it's not odd. It just shows that there is either a lack of care or an unawareness that the 49ers were the team last year that also had the largest net rest disadvantage. They had a minus 20-day net rest disadvantage last year, which was the largest of any team in the NFL. And now this year, they get the largest once again. Is that fair? I mean, even if you don't think rest matters as much as I do, is that fair? No, it shouldn't be fair. We should be able to balance this out a lot better over the course of, I would like it over the course of the season, but at a minimum, if you're doing something like this where the graphic is so crazy from the haves and nots, then you need to balance it out year to year and help make and right the wrongs that you had last year. There is a 37-day swing in net rest edge between the best team of plus 16 for the Ravens and the worst team minus 21 for the San Francisco 49ers. That's a 37-day swing. That is the worst delta for any NFL season going back to 2000. Okay. And that's over a month. The season is 4 months long. Over a quarter of that we're talking about is the difference between the 49ers and the Baltimore Ravens. That is egregious amount of rest edge that the Ravens have that the 49ers do not have in a league that they're expected to compete against one another. This year, there are 101 games played out of 272 where a team has a rest advantage over their opponent. 101. That is the most ever in NFL history. A schedule that we see this year, there are 66 games being played where one team has at least 3 days of rest advantage over their opponent. A 1 day rest difference is not terrible. Obviously, that's like we're talking about Monday versus Sunday. It does factor in a little bit later on in the season. It's not terrible. 3 days, that is measurable. You can measure it. We'll talk about that later. The 49ers have 8 games with a rest disadvantage. That's 50% of their schedule, basically, is a rest disadvantage. That is the most of any team in NFL history. And we've got multiple teams playing at least 7 games where their opponent has a week to prepare for the game. In the last 31 years, only 3 teams have that happened to. Now we've got this season, we've got multiple teams in this season alone having that issue. And then one of the worst things as it relates to player health and safety, which we'll talk about more later, is 9 teams are playing 3 games in 10 days. And we'll talk about how rare that is. But I will just tell you, that was absolutely shocking to me. And I knew it might happen for the teams on Christmas to make it so that they could play on Christmas. I had no clue that we were going to get 5 other teams have that happen to them for no reason other than the NFL is just trying to do new things and try to shrink teams around so they can get more games in prime time on the nights that they want for these narratives. We'll talk more about that, but that was absolutely egregious. But this is what happens when you're not focused on these things and you're focused on making good narratives for TV. You get historic issues for a lot of teams around the league.
And I know that was a lot of information. We're going to hit on it soon. But like I said, you can go over to Sharp Football Analysis. This is all in an article. You can come back and read it, in chunks. But there's a ton in here because there, like you, that list illustrated, there was a lot that Warren found as he was going through this. And so head over to Sharp Football Analysis, also where you can pre-order the 2024 Sharp Football Preview book, where we will have even more work about the schedule and how it's going to affect things. But before we get into kind of several of those individual categories, before we go into those, the NFL has discussed rest. Mike North, who again, VP of Broadcast Planning, went on the Ross Tucker Show, did a lot of other shows as well, and just kind of explained the NFL's thinking. And we're not taking shots at Mike North, by the way. He explained very well kind of where the NFL was coming from. But he was the face of what's going on, so we kind of want to get the NFL's viewpoint on it. And he talked about kind of the rest thing. He actually talked about Warren's work about rest, and said, I believe they don't know if rest is a thing. So I think we have a clip of that, producer Mike.
Rest advantage or disadvantage, and I bring that up because every year, and I'm sure you're familiar with him, Warren Sharp, who's an absolute data guy. He's all over the rest disparity, and in fact, it is something that we do talk about on our betting podcast, the Even Money podcast. I never, to be honest with you, Michael, I never even heard of it till like 2 or 3 years ago, but now it's become something that people talk about, and I'm sure there's at least some teams that think that there's something real to that. Is that something that you guys now take into account, either for a given week or over the course of a season, the rest disparity, rest disadvantage?
Because it's something that people are talking about, we obviously have to pay attention to it. I'm curious, when you think about it on your betting pod or when you do talk to Warren, is it real? Like, do you bet differently because a team is rested or not rested? If you find something like that, then obviously there's something to it. I don't think we have found that yet. Think about last season where the 2 teams with the greatest total negative rest disparity were the Rams and the Niners. You had a unprecedented run for, I think it was Kansas City, maybe 5 or 6 weeks in a row with a negative rest. And I know Warren was really focused on Philadelphia having to play, something like Dallas, Buffalo, San Francisco all right in a row with those guys coming off of Thursdays or something like that. Those 4 teams probably had the biggest gripes, if you will, in terms of negative rest disparity from last season. All 4 made the playoffs, 2 made the Super Bowl, 1 got a ring. Like, I'm not sure you can say that negative rest disparity was a unfair competitive inequity that any of those teams had to face. So like everything else, we'll keep an eye on it.
I think the points that he's making there are, like, from a 10,000-foot view, are actually makes sense, right? He's saying, all right, so we looked at last year. You've already mentioned that the 49ers this is now 2 years in a row. We mentioned the Chiefs. Those are obviously the two teams that played in the Super Bowl. And so, like, from a surface level analysis, what he's saying makes some sense. But I think, and you do this in the article, and I want you to talk about it, when you dig in on the actual games of rest disparity that we're talking about, that run for the Chiefs, the games for the 49ers, that runs for the Eagles that he mentions, when you actually dig into those runs, you see that rest did actually affect those teams. And you think about some of the bad runs that they had last year, and maybe rest played a role in that. So let's get started with the Chiefs and that run that you definitely, you talked about a lot in the article from last year.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as you said, on the zoomed out level, he makes some great points, but actually look at these teams. Look at these teams and look at their season. And then once I share this information with you, you tell me if rest didn't impact the Kansas City Chiefs, and we'll go through a few of them. Okay, let's talk about the Kansas City Chiefs. When they played with a rest deficit of 2 or more days, they were 2-3. 2 out of 5 games did they win. That's 40%. And they went 1-4 ATS. That's 20% cover rate. Now, why do we talk about the sports betting side of this? Because the sports betting side of it covers the expectation for the game, right? If you are a massive favorite in 10 games and you win 8 of them, let's say, maybe you were actually supposed to win 8. So winning 8 out of 10 is not that impressive. But if you were an underdog in all those games and you won 8 of 10, it is. So that's why we want to bake in the line here, and I'll tell you the cover rate so we can get a good understanding as to, are you exceeding expectations or are you falling short of expectations? They went 1-4 in those 5 games. Ended up playing Jake Browning and the Bengals in Kansas City in week 17. Though they were trailing entering the fourth quarter, they scored 9 unanswered points to earn a cover. If that did not happen for the Kansas City Chiefs, they would have been 0-5 ATS. They would not have won a single one of their games where they had a rest disadvantage. What happened in their other games? They went 13-2. So 2 out of 5 wins when they had that 2 or more day rest disadvantage, but they went 13-2 in the games when they did not have to deal with that, and they covered 12 out of those 15 games. So they went from an 80% cover rate when they're playing with regular rest all the way down to a 20% cover rate when they're playing on short rest or less rest than their opponent, a rest disadvantage, a rest deficit, as it were. So it massively impacted the Kansas City Chiefs last year. They were a good enough team to overcome it. And so the NFL suggesting that, wow, the best teams that we had in the league were able to still make it to the Super Bowl. These were the teams that were Super Bowl favorites to make it to the Super Bowl with the given schedule before the season started. The betting favorites were the 49ers and the Chiefs. Despite all the schedule issues, they were still so talented that they could overcome that and make it there. And lo and behold, they did. But it doesn't mean the rest didn't affect them. It affected them in a massive way. We'll talk about these next couple as well, because I think you'll see the point. And the point is that if rest affects the best teams in the league, then what is rest doing to some of the teams that aren't quite as good? And how fair is it to screw certain teams with rest? But let's keep going. Let's go to the next team, the Super Bowl runner-up.
Well, no, I think you should just keep going with the 49ers. Okay. and then straight in the Eagles. Yeah. Yeah.
So the 49ers, I called out 3 games where they were at massive rest disadvantages last season, notable games. They went 0-3 ATS in those games. The game against the Bengals week 8, where the Bengals had plus 8 days of rest edge. The game versus the Browns in week 6 off of a bye week, and the game against the Seahawks in week 14, where Seattle was off of a mini bye week. The 49ers go 0-3 in those games. They lost against the spread by a whopping 32.5 points combined. They were favored in those games by 14.5, 9.5, and 4.5 points. I mean, they were supposed to win these games, in some cases, blow out their opponents. And they went 0-3 ATS. They just won 1 out of those 3 games. All told, when they played at a rest deficit last year of 2 or more days, they were 2-2 straight up. So they were flipping coins when they're at a rest disadvantage, and 1-3 ATS. But when they weren't in that situation, this was a team that obviously was very good 9-3 straight up, and they covered the spread in 58% of their games as opposed to 25%. So the 49ers, were they impacted by having rest issues? Absolutely. They were impacted last season in those games when they were having the rest issues. They were just such a good team that when they didn't have rest issues, they still won enough games to make it to the Super Bowl. And then the Philadelphia Eagles, Mike described it. And again, we're not hating on Mike North here. This is just the NFL's position. He is trying to defend their position. And so I'm defending my position as well. The Eagles, this span from week 12 to week 14, where they were playing with rest disadvantages in all three of those games, is what the issue that I had. I'm looking at my thing here. Philadelphia Eagles were like the 6th worst team last year based on net rest. And in this particular 3-game stand, they didn't cover the spread in any of those games. Week 12, week 13, or week 14, they were a 3-point and a 3.5-point underdog to the Niners and the Cowboys in week 12 and week 13. They got smoked in both of those games at a massive rest disadvantage. They lost 42-19 to the Niners, 33-13 to the Cowboys. And then they were 3-point favorites against the Buffalo Bills. They were losing at home by 10 points in the fourth quarter. They had to kick a 59-yard field goal just to send the game at the buzzer into overtime, where they were losing in overtime as well. They ended up pushing that game because they were favored to win it. Over the course of the entire season, the Eagles were 0-5-1 ATS and won just 3 out of those 6 games when they had less rest than their opponent. But in all the other games, they were 7-2 straight up and 5-2-2 ATS. That's 63% ATS as opposed to 0% ATS in 6 games. So yes, the rest once again massively impacted the Philadelphia Eagles. So I just think it's silly to sit here and suggest that because those 3 teams ended up having winning records, that rest didn't impact them. Clearly, I've laid it out. Rest massively impacted them in the games that they were dealing with the rest of disadvantages. And I don't think it's fair to ignore that and just pretend like it didn't happen or it wasn't an issue just because the Kansas City Chiefs have Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid and are able to still win a Super Bowl, even if they play well in the other games that they don't have rest issues.
Yeah, and I am interested in, and there's no way to prove this, and this becomes just conjecture at this point, whereas I think what you're laying out is in those weeks, those teams very clearly played worse than expectations, both from their just general overall expectations at being good teams, and also from Vegas expectations, which obviously when we're trying to figure out, okay, how much is this team supposed to win by? Vegas is what we're looking at by all of those in those weeks. But I am very, very interested in the Eagles schedule because that run you're talking about, that game they pulled out at the very end against the Bills, and then, those games that they were blown out, that was the beginning of the end for that team. That team won, I believe, 1 game the rest of the season after the Bills game against the Giants, and then, you completely just kind of, went away easily in the playoffs. And you wonder, does that have some effect? Is this almost was it a spiral effect? And so, yeah, I think when you look at a lot of these individual situations, you say the Eagles made the playoffs. Okay, but after that rest run that we talked about and we highlighted last year, then their season fell apart. So it's really hard to hold them up as an example and say, hey, yeah, this is a success story, that none of this matters, when the time period you're talking about after that, they won a single game. And so it's just they're a very interesting team to bring up to me. 49ers and Chiefs, I get it. They played in the Super Bowl. That makes a lot of sense. Bringing the Eagles into this conversation, that's a really tough case to make kind of from my perspective. What about any overall trends? Just looking at the entire league as a whole when we're talking about, this rest disparity.
I mean, look, this is where it becomes a little bit trickier because there are edges from a betting perspective as it relates to rest. I published a little bit of that in the article. I share some of the overarching win-loss results and or ATS percentages. But if you're listening to this right now, one of the thousands of people that are streaming with us online, you should know that if you bet these games and you're able to hit just based upon like betting because of rest, and you're able to hit 54 or 55%, I mean, like, pack it up. That's a money maker. That is okay, because with one metric that you're looking at and you're able to hit that rate, that shows you that that's a massive factor. Now, the NFL is not betting on games, doesn't understand -110, doesn't know what the odds that you have to cover. They might not think that that's a massive element, but 55, 54% is humongous, is outstanding. And there are very basic rest formulas that you can write up and look up the results of what those games are. And I'm just telling you, rest absolutely matters, whether it's the last 2 to 3 years and you're looking at all the games, or where it matters the most is later on in the season, but you want to increase the sample size. So go back a decade and look from week 13 onwards. 56.6% ATS over the course of 130 to 140 games. Over the course of a decade, from only at the late end season, you're hitting almost 57%. Ridiculous. So rest absolutely matters, whether you're talking about the best of the best teams, which I already outlined how it impacted them, or you're talking about the league in general. Rest matters. Okay. I don't see how you could say it doesn't, but that's great. If you want to keep ignoring the fact that there's issues when teams play off of less rest, I propose the following thought experiment. Go talk to some coaches around the league and ask them if they would rather have this blind schedule. Would you rather have the schedule that gives you plus 16 days rest edge, or would you rather have the schedule that gives you minus 21 days rest edge? You get to pick whichever schedule you want. Tell me how many of those teams think the minus 21. Tell me how many of the players would rather play with 10 days rest or 3 days rest. It's a no-brainer when you actually think logically, just simply about rest as it relates to players, as it relates to coaches, as it relates to getting ready for these games. When these guys talk to teams, they understand that. I talk to teams too. I'm telling you, nobody in the right mind on any of the teams that I've ever spoken with would rather have a schedule that has worse rest or plays on short weeks. So it's pretty evident what teams are hoping to get in their schedule. They don't calculate it right away all of the time, but rest is absolutely a thing. And so that's why I'd like to play this next, this video from when Mike North is talking, and listen closely here, because he's talking about spacing out rest, spacing out rest within a team's schedule. The irony to me of that is I thought rest wasn't a thing. We didn't care about rest. Why would we care about rest? Now he's talking about giving these mini buys at different points so that helps the teams and spaces out their rest so that they aren't going several weeks without having any type of rest, like 7-8 weeks without having any type of extra rest. If rest matters, then it should matter always, not just when you want it to matter. So go ahead and roll that video.
We're looking at the Amazon package and thinking about, hey, can we put a few teams on twice? And that will, kind of lift that EKG of their ratings every week, maybe raise the whole bar. So you got a handful of teams now, a lot more than we're used to, playing multiple short weeks. So can you spread those 2 short weeks out? You get the mini bye after your Thursday. Can we separate those mini buys from each other, from the full bye? Make sure that everybody's got those kind of 3 separate rest periods. I don't think, again, we're doing a good job if you got, both your Thursdays and your bye all done by week 8. Then you've got whatever it is, 9 or 10 weeks uninterrupted of football. Try to give everybody that rest period somewhere in there. If you're going to play those multiple short weeks, take advantage of the time off after with that mini bye and spread those strategically throughout the year.
Yeah, I think that's your point is, okay, well, if that matters, then don't we agree then that rest matters, right? We agree then that rest matters. So this should probably be something that we look at.
Yeah, easy answer there. I agree. I think it matters at all times. It matters when you're scheduling mini buys. It matters for the teams who have to play all these weeks in a row without rest. It should matter beyond just where are we going to place their bye. Is it week 5? Then they've got a lot of games after that. Is it week 13? Then they have a lot of games before that. If rest is a factor in how we place the bye, and teams can get to choose and tell us we want an early bye or a late bye, and we can factor that in because they care about when they're getting their rest, then rest is a factor in general for these teams. And if we're making schedules, and I'm going to continue, I'll tell you this, Ray, and everybody who's listening, this graphic right here, okay, this is for 2020. This is bad for podcasting, but whatever. This is 2022, and this is 2021. And I am telling you, sorry, this is 2023. This is 2022. But the bottom line is I do this for the last several years. Every single year, this graphic gets wider and wider. There are teams with much more rest edge, and there are teams with much more rest disadvantage. Okay. And it continues to happen. We are not getting it to the point where this is getting narrower. It's more balanced. Some teams are getting screwed more and more and more every year, and others are getting helped more and more and more every year. And it's the wrong direction for this thing to be heading.
So let's talk about a few of those teams, and we've hit on them already. If we look at that graphic, the 49ers, and again, all of this is over at Sharp Football Analysis. Teams helped and hurt by the 2024 schedule. You can see this graphic. You can print off, download, do whatever you want with this graphic. It is all there for you. But the 49ers have the worst net rest edge among all teams. They're followed by the Broncos, Colts, Seahawks, Chargers, and Saints. So what specifically about the 49ers schedule this year are they struggling with? Like you already mentioned, this is the second year in a row we've had this. What particularly with this 49ers schedule, puts them at the bottom of this list this year?
It's absolutely egregious. Obviously, you just said it's historic. I've said that as well. From week 7 onward, okay, this is a team that plays 6 out of their 11 games at a rest disadvantage, which is the most in the NFL. And not just that, I went back to my database to 1990. There is no other team with more games at a rest disadvantage from week 7 onwards than the 49ers. That only happened to 3 teams in 35 years since 1990. The 49ers, again, they play 8 games at a rest disadvantage. That's the most ever in NFL history. They play 4 games versus teams coming off of a bye. That's tied for the most in 35 years since 1990 with only 2 other teams. They play 3 short week road games. It's just all of these things factored in. You could see all of those mini buys that are down there at -3 where their opponents have 3 extra days of rest over them. You can see the full buys that teams have before they play the 49ers. It's ridiculous. So are the 49ers probably still going to be a good team? Yeah, they're one of the favorites in the entire NFL to win the whole thing again this year. Just because they have all this rest disadvantage does not necessarily mean this team is going to go 3-14 this season. But the issue is it makes it more difficult for them in these games and to stack game after game after game like this for them. When if you look at the top of this, and we'll talk about them momentarily, the New England Patriots, second from the top here, play 0 games at a rest disadvantage, and you give 8 games at a rest disadvantage for the San Francisco 49ers is preposterous, in my opinion.
What about we look at the top, you mentioned the top, Ravens at the top, and by a lot at +16. And then we have the Patriots and the Vikings, the Eagles, and the Packers as well. And the Ravens, you mentioned the Patriots there. They have no games they're playing at a rest disadvantage. The Ravens have 2, and each of them, that's a day rest advantage where they have a big advantage as well. So what's happening there in that Ravens schedule?
Yeah, not only just looking at the overall rest edge, but if you look at the Baltimore Ravens just in the AFC North games, all the other teams, when they're playing AFC North games in division, all these teams are 0 or negative rest. It's going to sum up, right? There's 4 teams. They're all going to play 3 divisional games. It's going to match up, right? So the math has to add up. Bengals are at 0. Steelers are at -2. Browns are at -4. That means the Ravens are going to be at +6. So within the division, just when the teams play each other, the Ravens even have a 6-game edge over the second best team and 8 to 10 games edge over the other teams in that division. If you look at the net rest edge overall for the AFC North, Ravens are at +16. Browns and Steelers are both all the way down at +2, and the Bengals are at -2. And John Harbaugh just is awesome when he has rest edges. He's 21-5, which is 81% since he became a head coach with a rest edge of 3+ days. That's the best record in the NFL during that span. Since 2007, the Ravens are 10-1. That's 91% with a 3+ day rest edge. You can see they've already got 4 games on their schedule. So, odds are they're winning at least 3 of those 4 games. If the past has shown us anything about Harbaugh's ability to prepare for the games and the Baltimore Ravens edges that they have on those. And, they have an NFL high 5 games with more rest than their opponent. 4 of these are meaningful with those 3 extra days of rest. And most of them come late in the season when rest matters more. They've got 3 days extra rest against the Steelers, 4 days against the Browns, and 7 days against the Giants. So it's great. And think about this Ray, when we're talking about who is one of the newest players to switch teams, the old Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry being able to run against D linemen and linebackers who are playing with less rest than his team has and his offensive linemen have, that should be a factor. Though the Ravens have a lot of work to do along that offensive line, it's going to be interesting to see how he fares against defenses that might be worn down compared to his offense.
Yeah, if we get fourth quarter Derrick Henry in the second quarter, I'll the fantasy people like me would probably be very, very okay with that. In addition to rest edges, your article over at Sharp Football Analysis has a ton of other factors in there. I don't know if we have time to go through all of them. You've already hit on games with more or less rest than the opponent for some of these players, which we saw in that graphic. I mean, the Colts in there, the Colts were interesting. You look at, they have a single game where they play with more rest edge, and it is one game. It's one day, and then you look at the other side of it, and you could see the disadvantage that they have as well. And so there's a lot of that in the article. So make sure you check that out. I'm very interested with short week road games, and it seems like we saw a big spike in those short week road games this year versus what we had seen in the past.
Yeah, we've got 42 short week road games. And this is a challenge for the schedule makers, as Mike North indicated. They have to figure out how to put more games during the week on primetime. And that's going to make it so that there are more short week road games. So their hands are tied a little bit by what Roger Goodell's goals are. But how do you balance this around the league? Like, how do you spread this out? How do you do some things? And I'll tell you, from a statistical sports betting perspective, short week road games, they will make you money. If you know what you're looking for and how to bet these games, it's not going to be hard for you to lose on them because it's not going to be hard for you to win on them because there are definite ATS. 40% ATS dogs after week 6 on short week road games over the last decade. That's 150 games. We're talking 40% cover rate for dogs after week 6 on a short week. And it's even better if you exclude the 2020 season. What happened in 2020? Why would we want to exclude that? Because there are no home teams, true home teams, because there are no fans in the stands. So it's a lot easier for the road teams, and road teams obviously crushed if you were betting these games in 2020. The sportsbook took far too long to catch up to that. So that's one great example. Another one, and we'll kind of steer everybody, Ray, to that article because I spent, I don't know, hours and hours writing this thing and bugged you far too much about it. And so
hours
is
not doing it justice. Hours is certainly not doing it justice. A lot of late hours, I would say. A lot of 2 a.m. Slack messages about very interesting things you found that I would read the next morning. I didn't want to break your heart and tell you I read it the next morning, but I in fact did. But there's so much good stuff in here, like you said. I think your work on 3 games in 10 days and 4 games in 17 days is so important, because I think that one really speaks to player health and why I think your point about how this should be, the NFLPA should maybe be involved in this, because if you have players playing 3 games in 10 days, 4 games in 17 days, that to me seems like a real player health issue, and we're seeing a lot more of it this year.
Yeah, we should, this is one that we should dig into. I do want to mention, the negated bye weeks is very cool.
Yeah.
Factoring in which teams have a bye week that the other team also has a bye week at that same time, or mini bye, something like that. So you don't get the true benefit of a bye week. But there's a variety of these things that you can read in the article where I talk about how much more frequently A, B, or C categories occurring this year compared to years past. And I track all this stuff. Like I said, I got 35 years of this data that we can work off of. The 3 games in 10 days, though, this seems preposterous. So let's lay it out here. The reason that the NFL decided to go back to this, because here's how many times they did it in 2019. Here's how many times they did it in 2020. Here's how many times they did it in 2021. 2022.
For listeners, he's holding up a 0. He's holding up a
2023. 0. Every single one of these years. Yes, if you're not watching the video, which by the way, this is a great opportunity to promo our YouTube channel. Go to YouTube and check out our YouTube channel. Ray, drop the channel in there where people can follow us on YouTube.
You can follow us if you go to YouTube, search Warren Sharp. You will find us, the Sharp Football YouTube channel. Make sure you check that out. You can find all of our podcasts there as well.
Yeah, there you go. So 3 games in 10 days, though. They haven't been doing it. They have not been doing that at all. And now we go and we see that they're doing it 9 times this year. How in the world are they doing it 9 times? I thought, okay, well, obviously this is happening because of the Christmas games. And yes, that's true. How do you get it? You play a Sunday game, then you play a Saturday game, and then you play a Wednesday game. Boom. So 3 games in 10 days. Really short, really difficult. But the league, which was obvious. I mean, I called this out beforehand. The way that they would make this work is that you get the same turnaround as a Sunday to Thursday game as you do from a Saturday to Wednesday game. So these teams, because you can't play Sunday to Wednesday, that's way too tight. So these teams who they wanted to play on Christmas, they would also have to play the other opponent on Saturday beforehand. So you got 2 teams playing on 4 teams playing one another on Saturday, and you switch the opponent, and then you play that other team on Wednesday, and boom, now you can make it work. Understand that they got $150 million from Netflix. I understand why they would do that. But for the fact that they went ahead and did this for 5 other teams for no real reason except to just put more games on Monday Night Football and Thursday Night Football is egregious to me. You've played Sunday to Thursday for years now, but they never were scheduling another, like a Monday to Sunday to Thursday. It was always Sunday to Thursday. Okay. Now the league is coming in here with this new sequence, which they're doing 5 times this year. They're not taking any money from Netflix. They're just doing it 5 times. This Monday, Sunday, Thursday. So you're playing back-to-back short weeks, because Monday to Sunday, that's a short week. And then Sunday to Thursday, that's another short week. And you've got 3 games in 10 days. Most of these are happening later on in the season. And it's absolutely going to put wear and tear on these players, on their bodies. And it's not fair for those teams to have to deal with that. Understand the Christmas thing. It's not great, but I understand it. This is quite ridiculous in my opinion. So we talked about the fact that it's occurring. The Bengals, the Bears, the Seahawks, the Saints, and the Cowboys. Those are your 5 teams that have to play this sequence of Monday, Sunday, Thursday. This is the first time in a long time that this has happened. I went back and looked through my database. 0 times the prior 5 years to this. The prior 10 years, it only happened twice. So in 10 years worth, it happened 2 times. And now it's happening 9 times. A lust for the almighty dollar, Ray.
Yeah, and I think the other point about it is, like we said, 4 of those times you want to play on Christmas Day. Christmas Day is a Wednesday. That's the way it works. They got a lot of money from Netflix. The teams that are playing won't get all of that money, but they'll get some share of that money. That's the way it works. But to do it an additional 5 other times for no reason, it's confusing to do that, especially if you haven't done it in the last 5 years. That suggests you have some apprehension about this, some perhaps player safety apprehension about this. And then because we're just going to do it for Christmas in this very specific special time of Christmas being on a Wednesday and taking a lot of money to have those games happen there, that, okay, let's just open the floodgates and continue to do it. It's a very odd kind of approach to it. And then like again, there are we have a couple other examples of 4 games in 17 days, which again, we're just compressing that even further and getting more of these games into that period. And I think that it's important to say, okay, so your rest is the same as it would have normally been between a Sunday and a Thursday game. And that is true, but there has to be some multiplier effect here, that it's not just one short week followed by a mini bye. We are now stacking these short weeks on top of each other. And that to me seems like the real concern. I think the short week, Sunday to Thursday, already that's a concern. And now we're just going to continue to stack those. That to me is it's just tough to kind of rationalize, especially outside of when you have to do it because of this deal you have with Netflix.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the fact that they moved away from this when it had happened a little bit in the past, and they moved away from it, why would you be doing that? Well, maybe you're doing it for player safety reasons, to all of a sudden introduce it to this extent and just sneak these other 5 instances of this into the schedule when it hasn't happened for 5 years once, and you're sneaking them in for no real reason except just to get a couple more these teams onto prime time seems quite selfish. And like you said, the NFLPA should start to be aware of this. I mean, they should look at this article and realize that this is how their players are being exploited by the league for the league to get their money. And these players are the ones ultimately that are paying the cost of this. The coaches' staffs too, when their teams lose games that they should have potentially won or have a better shot in, or getting blown out in a game that might have been close because of these rest issues, which we've already identified and established are real and are measurable. It's affecting jobs and it's affecting players' careers potentially. And I really think that the if we weren't doing this, Ray, I'm not trying to like pat ourselves on the back here, but I don't know how many people are talking about this on Monday after the schedule is released, right? I haven't heard anybody else discussing any of this, but it is a factor that these players should at the bare minimum and the PA be aware of, that it's occurring and that it's being magnified and introduced at a much higher rate. And they should be able to access that knowledge and do with it what they choose in the future. But certainly it needs to be pointed out.
We covered a lot here in this last hour about the NFL rest. There's a lot more, like I said in the article, over at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Go and check it out. There's a lot in there. We also have a few individual team notes in there and some other articles about individual teams and how the schedule has affected them. You know, the 49ers, the Ravens, the Dolphins, a lot of other teams in there as well. Go and check that out. Also at Sharp Football Analysis, you can pre-order the 2024 Sharp Football Preview, which we are all working on now. We are all deep in the throes of that. We will have updates for fantasy rankings coming in the next few weeks, so make sure that you're paying attention to Rich Rebar and Todd Burrows and what they've got cooking in the fantasy football draft kit. Those two actually will be back to talk some fantasy football here in the next few days on the feed, so make sure you subscribe to the Sharp Football Podcast. Head over to YouTube, search Warren Sharp. You'll find our YouTube feed. Hit subscribe on that. You'll get notified when our videos go live over there. And yeah, thanks for taking the time here to chat with me about this, Warren. I know it's one of your pet projects. It's one of your babies, and it is something I think that you are one of the people that is talking about this, one of the few people talking about this, and it seems like this is something that does actually matter. And so it's an interesting. When I looked at the NFL schedule release, I always think, I knew who they were playing all this time, but yeah, this particular part of the schedule release, I do think is something important to talk about. So I appreciate you joining the podcast, your namesake podcast, and talking a little bit about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you kind of teed up there, I said it before, there are 101 games this year that are going to be played where one team has a rest advantage over their opponent. I guarantee you, I will be listing out in the 2024 football preview every single one of those games and what the betting line is. So if you want to try to bet the rest edges, which I've already outlined in the podcast and the article, do exist. The book will have 100% of those games in there and listed out quite clearly. So go over to sharpfootballanalysis.com and get your copy of the 2024 football preview, which will be dropping before you know it, which is great news for you, the listener. Is terrible news for me and Ray and everybody else, because we got a ton of work that we're doing. Yeah. I literally just changed direction to focus on the schedule when it's released. It cost me about a week of my time writing on the book, but we've been working on this book for a long time now, and the deadline is coming soon. So we got a lot to do in a little time, but that's great news for you guys. So hope you guys enjoy the book this year. I love hearing the feedback. And thanks for inviting me on to go over the schedule release with you, Ray. And certainly I'm looking forward to joining you again shortly. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight.
Yeah, no, I looked at my schedule and the deadlines that are coming up today. That may have been a mistake. It may have sent me into a depression spiral, but we're gonna fight out of it. Like I said, there'll be more on the podcast feed next couple days with Rich Rebar and Todd Burrows, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And we'll be back to talk with you real soon.